Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Uh, I reached 25 pounds lost yet last week. Um, Happy July 4th to everyone here in America. Uh, it's a day for patriotism, even though it's a subject and an issue I think we are in very poor understanding of. But all the same, have a great holiday, guys, and get your barbecue and your grill on, your lake and your cabin, and that whole thing. Um, I listened to one of my favorite records from my childhood the other day at work. I was just having one of those days where I was a little bit agitated, how life can be. And so I played Appetite for Destruction. One of my favorite records as a child. And I probably said this before, but I got the record right as it came out. When Welcome to the Jungle and Paradise City were the only singles. Like Night Train came out. Mr. Brownstone. Excuse me. And it wasn't until a year after the record had been out and Sweet Child of Mine was released as a single that record really blew up and hit the charts and became kind of a commonality. Everyone was talking about it then. But I already been listening to the record for a year, knew the words to every song on the record. And I remember washing dishes at my first job, singing along to Paradise City and My Michelle and They're Out to Get Me and It's So Easy. And it's one of the great rock records of all time. And it's nothing they really approached again. Lies is a departure. The Use Your Illusions are half Elton John records at times with the pianos and the strings and November Rains and all that. Those are very exorbitant, over the top productions. Appetite for Destruction was the antithesis of that. It was this raw, in your face, ain't giving no fucks, anti production. Yet it's a great sounding record all the same, but it's raw and it's punchy. Uh, for all those people who like the Ramones and punk rock, I will throw you Appetite for Destruction on any time over Blitzkrieg Pop. I mean, any of that pseudo punk, it just doesn't have the edge or the hardness or the tenacity and the grit. I think Blitzkrieg Bob is kind of, let's see, it's kind of, it seems packaged a little bit to me. You know what I mean? Sex Pistols were obviously that. The Clash, which is probably the greatest punk rock band, aren't really a punk rock band in most of the senses of the word, even though their roots were there. But Appetite for Destruction is just such a raw record. Linked to Exile on Main Street, linked to Toys in the Attic, some of the great rock records of all time. It's rawer than anything AC/DC even does. Highway to Hell, Back in Black, those songs are fairly punched clean and everything's just in the right place. These records it's a little sloppy, but brilliantly so. The guitars are kind of chopping over each other, Izzy and Slash, but I so enjoyed it. I was singing along to every word of the record. And I just was enamored by its rawness and its in the earbuds too. It was just sounding really clean and getting all the different parts really nicely. Which, as a kid, I wasn't really that perceptive of the different parts. Who was playing what? But now when I listen to rock and roll, it's actually quite easy to dissect it and hear the various parts and who's playing what. But it's also a great little piece of insight into the thinking of white Americans. And Axl Rose is a study in middle America, teen angst, ignorance, pride and arrogance. He is borderline offensive at times. And of course, on the Lies, Lies, Lies EP, there's a couple songs in there, one in a million for the most part, where he really crosses some lines in terms of what we think of as appropriate today. And again, but it's still the thinking of a young white male from Indiana in LA trying to make a starving, trying to survive. All those people were threats to him in some way because they were all fishing for the same crumbs, trying to collect the same few fish out of a pond. And so all the various groups that he kind of calls out, it does give you some insight into how white America thinks and feels. But that song aside, just the grit and the anger and the angst and the mind point, the viewpoint of all of it. It's a great little piece of insight into how young Americans feel. And even as a young Canadian, I related to a lot of it really well with my teenage rebellion and wanting to move away from my parents' evangelism and being a preacher's kid. That record, I heard the F bomb in that record more than I heard the F bomb in music up to that point. I mean, there was a few fucks here and there on songs I had liked, but that record, he curses throughout it. But it's liberating. It's empowering. It's genuine, and that's part of what makes that record so great. Is it's so genuine. It's so real. It's so honest, and in all its ugliness. And when you cross-reference that to young black youth, who have a whole lot of different things that they're fighting for. You know, young black men at Blue Note, the young black men of the avant-garde movement, the free jazz movement, the spiritual jazz movement, even going back into the bebop era and the hard bop era. It was a different type of militancy and aggression and fed-up, anxiety-ridden exhaustion that fuels that type of resistance. So we all have resistance in our own various cultures in various ways, and we speak about what ails us. It's just our cultures, our communities, the groups that we belong to will shape greatly how we voice that in our art forms. And of course, being white Americans, they could say almost anything they wanted to in a microphone back in 1987. And it's, you know, I mean, there's a lot of misogyny and a lot of sexual depravity, but it's, again, it's honest, which I can always respect honesty over some plastic, phony presentation of who you think people should see you as. I'd rather you show me who you really are. And it's an interesting case study to think about often how I speak about jazz players, how they're voicing how they feel. And then to listen to that and to get such a clear insight into how this group of white Americans felt. And of course, I don't think Axl represented the rest of the band all the time, and I'm sure that was not the case frequently. Axl certainly seems to be a bit more of a racist and a bigot and I don't want to say sexist, because I think probably all were probably borderline predatory, but that was part of the whole scene. The celebration of groupies and the tour sluts and the girls were as proud to wear that jacket at times as the men were to put that jacket on them. But again, the times have changed. What can you do? But it's still a great record. It's still a great example of what raw rock and roll sounds like, and how the second you start adding strings and overproduced and all kinds of fancy backing vocal, you lose a lot of that edge that makes it what it is. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm not going to lie. I can still remember every word to almost every song pretty much, you know. Fun exercise. And it'll give you a great piece of insight into how different the two camps feel about their role in this world. Moving on, I want to talk to you today about Count Basie and Duke Ellington. And I think one of the issues we have with these guys when we go back further in the jazz canon is there's a disconnect because there's not enough footage, not enough interviews, not enough knowing the men behind the music. And with Miles and Coltrane, the later generation guys, there's a lot of documentaries, a lot of YouTubers, a lot of information. So we feel like we're starting to get to know some of these people. Even a guy like Hank Mobley, jazz fans know more about Hank now than anybody knew about Hank in his lifetime, which is sad, but it's, you know, at least he's getting that recognition now. Lee Morgan, documentaries and films about him. You know, when you get back to Duke and Count, two of the most important people in the history of this music, it's getting tougher to connect the stories and the footage, and they both lived into the 70s. So there is plenty of interviews out there with them. But there's a lot of things that I perceived and read into, and I've spent a long time over the years talking with Jean-Michel about Count and the Duke, because he knew both of them. He knew Count really well. He knew the Duke somewhat. But he also knew most of the men who played with these guys. So he's heard all the stories, all the dirt, all the behind the scenes. And I feel like the best way to start to appreciate these guys is for all of us to get to know them a little bit better. And one of the best ways for us to do that is for us to start sharing some of the stories and the insight and the knowledge about these two guys. The Count and the Duke are absolute institutions of this music. And jamming on a riff and just feeling the blues and the black church, Basie codified that. And most of the swing era borrows from the Basie camp. The simplicity, the swing, the hard edges, the dynamic crescendos. Basie could build something from a small whisper into a loud shout and just get you out of your chair. It was never as compositionally driven. Not to say there wasn't compositions, because of course there was. 1 O'Clock Jump at the Woodside, Silk Stockings. There's great Basie songs in the jazz canon. But again, a lot of it's based on a riff. With Ellington, it was more about sophisticated composition and creating opposition in the music, tonally, dynamically, chordally. A real brilliant mind, him and Billy Strayhorn, and their approach was very different. And there's a smaller portion of the swing era that borrows from the Duke than borrows from Count Basie. And a lot of even the contemporaries in this music were very influenced by one or the other. But the number who were influenced by Duke is a question I'm going to ask Jean-Michel here is much smaller. And again, Ellington didn't really consider himself jazz music. He considered his music Ellington music. And so he didn't really cater to regulations and rules or standards and how things are done. Ellington kind of made music in his own image all the time. And so he really pushes the boundaries of what his music is beyond swing music, beyond jazz music, beyond black music. It's Ellington music. It's this global, thought-provoking, sensual, spiritual voyage of music. And that's what Ellington is. So I once again enlisted my friend Jean-Michel to interact with us here and to respond to a few questions. And he can offer up some insights and some stories that help us to get to know these men better, which will help make their music come more to life. And that's the bottom line here is Ellington and Basie are such an important institution. And I think we all are doing ourselves and the music a disservice by not being fluent in the Count Basie and Duke Ellington orchestras. And it's not even about knowing their entire body of work, because they're both immense bodies of work, but to recognize how many of the legends of this music have their roots in one of these bands or both. The lists are incredibly long of the giants and the geniuses that played with Duke and with the Count. And they proliferate the 50s and 60s jazz scene from coast to coast. The European scene, playing with Duke, playing with Count was a badge of honor, and it gave you a credibility to kind of launch your own career at some point. It certainly seems as though people stay with Ellington much longer than Basie, and I guess Jean-Michel has even said some of that might be how much better Ellington paid his men. But I've asked Jean-Michel a series of questions. He's going to respond with some answers and some stories. And this is part one. I'll give you part two in a week or so we can have people digest this one. I hope you all enjoy it. Let's dive into some of the questions I gave to Jean-Michel, and let's enjoy some of his responses. Once again, a great thank you to Jean-Michel for his time. And he's such a wellspring of information. And it's a luxury for us to be able to tap into the first-hand stories he's been part of. And the number of stories he's got directly from so many of the greats, from the production side, from the musician side of things, from the touring side of things. He's talked to and seen a lot of the people in this industry. And sometimes it's a concert promoter that can tell you a lot of insight into how a guy behaves, how well he paid his players, how on time was he with his payments. All these things are kind of multiple sources can help us piece together a patchwork quilt of who a guy was. And I think the more we know the Duke and the more we understand the Count, the more we can really appreciate their personalities, the shyness of Count Basie, the the debonair swagger, sophisticated condescension of Ellington. If you watch him in most interviews, he's a character, and I'm not going to give any more of this away because that's what this next part of this is for. So here's part one. Hope you all enjoy it, and part two will be coming soon. So, in your mind, from the people you talked with and had talked jazz, which one of these two men was more fun to play with? I mean, it's a loaded question, but and Basie was kind of quiet and reserved, as we've spoken before, and Ellington was kind of debonair, and I'm sure both men earned their men's respect, and they both also were taskmasters at times, and I'm sure they both were fun at times. But in general, especially from the guys who played with both orchestras, who was the looser, funner guy to be around and hang out with? And I know they were both kind of reserved men in a way, from what you've told me and from what I've seen. Basie certainly didn't like the cameras much at all, and then Duke with the cameras is always very effusive and would throw your questions back at you. And if you ask Duke what's good music, he would ask you, "What do you think is good music? What do you think is a good question?" I don't think that's a good question. That's the kind of thing that Ellington would do. And so as I've read into their personalities, you can delve deeper as you knew these guys. So share with me a little bit about that for a minute.
Well, you know, speaking about Duke and Bill, sometimes it's easy to talk about musicians, about facts, to talk about real stories, because to people they would understand, because this is easy to understand, easy to talk with. With Basie, with Bill and Duke, that's the contrary, because both musicians were both totally different characters, but when it's time to put some words to explain the real things, it's difficult. I mean, you had to be surrounded, you had to be with them to really understand what's happened in their bands, in the minds, So I will try. I think more you know people, more it's difficult to explain things, especially with Bill and Duke. I think Duke, when it was time to play and rehearse, I think all the musicians in Duke's band were more concentrated. They were more religiously into the music, into the charts. So rehearsing and playing with Dukes was a lot of attention, requires a lot of attention, and a lot of you know you have to be really there. With Basie it was more, I can't say relaxed, but people they had more fun, uh, the sax section they play something, and when the trumpet section play, suddenly a guy from the band said something to the other guy and they crashed. It happened with Duke, but that was more the case with Basie. um, so I don't know if they had some more fun with Basie, but the mood was more relaxed and more let's say open to have a good time. You know.
So both men spent years on the road, and that's a fairly well-known fact. And of course, Basie comes out of the Kansas City, the North Texas, um, Southern Plains scene. with Jay McShann and Walter Page and Orrin Hot Lips Page and Walter Page and that whole history and lineage, which was very much built on riffs and playing the blues over a riff, and the riff was just meant to be repeated like an R&B riff, like a hip hop riff, and it was just a very simple format to express upon. And of course, Ellington comes from the DC area, was much more sophisticated and debonair, much more the composer. His songs had much more arrangement and much more melodic, forward composition. But which man spent more time touring over the course of the average year? And I know those Kansas City days, those guys were playing a lot. I know Ellington toured the country for decades. I know Basie stripped down to the smaller group at times in the 40s and the 50s. But of course, his orchestra again was running the world into the 70s and the 80s. And Ellington was doing his thing till his passing. And both orchestras continued on after their great leaders passed. But did one guy play more than the other on a regular basis, or were they both out there nonstop?
About touring, I don't know really. I think both of them tour all the time, everywhere in the world. I mean, Duke came earlier in Europe. The first European tour of Duke was in 1933, and then he did a second tour in 1939, just a few weeks before the Second World War. And then he came back to Europe in 1950. And in his band, in the tour in 1950, he had a special guest as Don Bias. A recording came out maybe 10 years, did in Zurich in Switzerland. So, and then on, I think most of the time Duke came to Europe almost every year until he died. But the last time I saw Duke, that was in November 1973, and he came back to New York, and I think he stopped playing in February 74, and he died in May 74. Basie came, first time he came in Europe, that's late 1954. He wanted to come to Europe in 1939, at the end of the 39, but before the Second World War, was canceled. And Basie disbanded his big band at the end of 1949, and he built this octet, but he stayed in the States, And when he reformed his new band in 1952, he toured all around USA and Canada, but he came to Europe in 1954, and he came to Europe every year too, until he passed away. By the way, the Count Basie Orchestra is still around and still playing his ass off. This band is directed today by a wonderful, great trumpet player, arranger, composer who was part of the Basie band. His name is Scotty Bernhardt, And if you get a chance, you have to listen to that. There is a new album came out a few months ago called Basie at Birdland. Basie at Birdland was a famous roulette album made in 1961, and for the 60th birthday anniversary of that great album, they decided to go back to Birdland and to do a new album with new charts, with new arrangements. So you have to, if you get a chance, listen to that band. So both of them travel everywhere, had gigs everywhere. So I can't say that Bill had much more work than Duke.
Now, this one might be the toughest question of all, and there's going to be a certain degree of objectivity with this one. both men were prolific in the studio and have recordings going back to the 20s. And Ellington's late 20s, Cotton Ballroom, and uh, the jungle music sound he was doing at that time. And uh, Basie, I think, maybe his recordings don't start until the 30s. But both had long careers with working with many labels in the 78 era into the LP era, on big labels, small labels, middle ground labels. Both have an incredible recorded legacy. And I think the tendency here would be to tip your hat and say, Basie did a great job, but Ellington's body of work is so immense and the composition is so unique and so special. And but people forget that Basie contributed to the Ellington songbook as well, to the jazz canon songbook as well. People play Basie standards as well. Uh, so whose body of work do you think stood the test of time? And I think Ellington's probably the obvious answer, but I love a lot of Basie's records. I really do. I love his small group stuff. His early clef stuff's pretty amazing. Even some of his later verve stuff is fun and polished. Uh, some of that roulette stuff's actually pretty incredible by Basie. And of course, Ellington has just an incredible volume. But if you had to pick which one's body of work you think, which one do you like better, or which one do you think has more value today? And then the second part of this question is, if you were an arranger and a composer as a musician in Bella Ellington's band or in Basie's band, which band were you more likely to be given the nod and say, we're going to do your song, we're going to arrange your song, we're going to allow you to arrange a song? I know Basie had a lot of guys coming in and composing and arranging in his group over the years. Thad Jones comes to mind, of course, but there was a long list of guys. And Ellington, the Billy Strayhorn is kind of the guy that you think of pretty much off the top in terms of working with Ellington. But if you were in Ellington's group, did you have a chance to share your compositions as much as you did with Basie's? Were you able to do that kind of your version of the arrangement, or was Ellington going to be having oversight all the time? I feel like Billy Strayhorn got a special glove and was allowed to do things probably most other people couldn't do. But guys like Ernie Wilkins were important. There's a long list of guys that were great composers and went on to great things after their time in these bands. And so, which one was a better proving ground to kind of get your own foot out in the door and establish yourself as a voice in jazz?
About the body of work, I think Duke composed, I think, more than 2,000. Duke and Billy Strayhorn and a couple of few others. But let's say that the Duke Ellington family, they had more 2,000 tunes and arrangements in their books. So that's a lot. But Basie had a lot too, you know. I think let's go this way. Duke Ellington, in terms of composition, he's the master. Then, in terms of a big band, phrasing, developing about, intensity, playing like a very small group and then explode, I think Count Basie is the king at that. I think Duke Ellington, no, that's not his thing. You can hear that in the album they play together for the first time and the only time. You have Basie in one way and you have Duke in another way, and you can hear the difference in the same composition. And that's great. You can listen to that, and you will have the answer. But to me, this is really clear that Duke, Billy Strayhorn, still have the one of the greatest composers and arrangers of all time, with Benny Carter. Excuse me, Benny is part of it. And then if you talk really about the big band, about really playing, soft and sometimes loud, very defined, very fine, very big. At the same time, I think Basie is, you know, he's one of the top guy, and I want you to prove this. I think Duke Ellington, the only great singer, that female singer that he had, was Ivy Anderson. But Duke didn't was not great at accompanying singers. You know, it was very good, but it was not. You know, if you compare it to Basie, if you listen Basie and Sinatra, I think this is the very best whoever was. If you compare Basie Sinatra and Duke Sinatra, to me, no. You know, the album with Duke and Sinatra was very good, but to me, it, it it's not a masterpiece. It sounds, you listen to two tunes and it sounds all the same for the entire album. With Basie, every tune is totally different. You know, so this is great to compare. Um, so Basie Basie was part to the jazz story about compositions too. You had Still Play, 1 O'Clock Jump, Lester Lipsin, and you had Shiny Stockings, Little Darling. You had a lot of tunes that Basie is responsible of. Um, so that's as I said, that's totally different. But again, compositions, you know, arrangements, that's Duke and Billy. But in terms of a big band, that's Basie.
And on some levels, couldn't we make a case that they're equally important? I know the predilection here would be to say who was greater, but I think they're both such icons and represented the two sides of the swing era in such different ways. Ellington, of course, was built on the composition and having the orchestra be his instrument, and uh, a different approach than Basie's hard swinging minimalism and finding a riff and just letting it fly. A lot of the Black Church and the blues are in Basie's sound, but of course Ellington's always got that spiritual and sexual underpinning to everything he does. And so I guess we could probably come to an agreement that these are the two most important people in the swing era. Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, a lot of greats were out there. Lucky Millinder, Andy Kirk. Just there's a long list of guys, honestly. Cab Calloway, um, Lionel Hampton led bands for a long time and was a very important figure. It's a pretty long and impressive scene of swing guys. So the next question I have for you here, I'm going to read off some of the great swing bands of the 30s into the 40s and the 20s as well, I guess. And I'd like for you to answer each one. Were they more influenced by Basie or by Ellington or neither? And we're going to start with the great Fletcher Henderson, who, of course, is one of the great arrangers in the history of this music. And some might say Fletcher was as big impression on Ellington and just everyone. Fletcher was a big name and voice. Benny Goodman, of course, Stan Kenton, Woody Herman, those guys kind of come later. The Dorsey brothers, um, Artie Shaw, Charlie Barnett. Was he more Basie or Ellington in your mind? Um, Jimmy Lunsford, Benny Moten. There's another great name, another great band. Andy Kirk, Cab Calloway, Harry James. We could look at guys like Claude Thornhill, who had a big band for a long time, Elliot Lawrence, Red Allen, Jay McShann, so Don Redman. Of those bands, Lucky Millinder, just kind of comment as to who were the Basie guys that were kind of in his camp and who were the guys that were really trying to embody what Ellington was about.
Well, speaking about other bands from the 30s and 40s and maybe later on, um, okay, first of all, Fletcher Henderson. Fletcher Henderson was with Jelly Roll Morton, it was the two first guys who decided to build a big band, and to write charts and parts for them, you know. So Fletcher Henderson was very special, but Fletcher Henderson had a band, but he composed at the same time, arranged for Benny Goodman and later on Basie and everybody. Um, when Fletcher Henderson disbanded his big band in 1939, he already arranged a lot for many people, but one the guy who played a lot of his arrangements at the most played, the most well played were Benny Goodman. I think he first wrote his first arrangement for Benny Goodman in 1934-35, King Porter Stone, and it's still, you know, up to date, So Fletcher Henderson disbanded his band in 1939, and Benny Goodman hired him as a piano player, composer, and arranger. But Fletcher Henderson to me is more in the Basie spirit. Um, the Dorsey brothers, Tommy Dorsey and Jimmy Dorsey, I think it's difficult to say. A little bit Basie, but not Duke, for sure. Artie Shaw, I was more with Duke. Charlie Barnett. Charlie Barnett is sometimes a little bit with Duke. But since the 50s, let's say that Charlie Barnett was more with Basie, But he did both with both of them, Jimmy Nosford, of course, more Basie, Benny Morton is Basie because Basie comes from Benny Morton. Benny Morton died, and when he died, Basie took under his wing the band, Cap Calloway, of course, Cap Calloway comes from, that's Basie. Harry James, of course, Count Basie, Claude Thornhill. I think for the sophistication, for the sound, for a lot of, contemporary sound, it comes from Duke to me, Ernie Lawrence as from Basie, Stan Kenton. That was some sophisticated music. So in a spirit about sophisticated music comes from Duke. But when you hear Jerry Mulligan, Bill Holman and all that stuff, it's more comes from Basie, Jay McShann is from, more from Basie. Lucky Millinder, of course, coming from Basie. We forget about Earl Hines, Earl Hines' big band comes from Basie too. And Don Redman. Don Redman, again, was one of the very few first arranger in 1928, 29. But I think it comes more from Basie than Duke. And there is a great big band that very few people know about, that's Harlan Leonard Big Band. And Harlan Leonard and his Rockets. This band was famous since 1936 to 1947, I think. And he recorded about 20 tunes in 1940. Harlan Leonard was part of the Basie Motown Big Band in 1929, 1930, 31, 32. He was a great alto, tenor, soprano, and baritone player. And he was a very fine uh, uh, arranger and a very fine, great leader from Kansas City. So Harlan Leonard, check out this guy and this great big man. Basie told me that this band, Harlan Leonard's big band, was one of the most swinging big band that he ever heard in his entire life. So it shows you, how great Harlan Leonard was. Uh, we forget a lot about Cap Calloway. To me, Cap Calloway was one of the greatest big band of all time. You see, with all those big bands, most of them, many things come from Basie. Why? Because most of the arrangers arranged for Basie. You took Charlie Barnett, Jimmy Lansford, Cap Calloway, Harry James, Jay McShann, Lucky Millinder, Jimmy Lansford from Basie too. Most of the arrangers, they arrange for all those groups. Basie first, and then they arrange for most of those guys. That's why maybe they sound a little bit like Count Basie, the arrangers, the composers like Jimmy Mandy with Great Man, Fletcher Henderson, Benny Carter, many, Cy Oliver, Gerald Wilson. They all compose and arrange for Basie and for Cap Calloway, for Jimmy Lansford, for Andy Kirk coming from Basie too. So Duke was very special. I mean, how many arrangers Duke asked to compose and arrange for his band, excepted, Billy Strayhorn? How many? That's not a lot, So that's why Duke was so very special. He didn't ask all those arrangers to arrange and compose for him. He did it by himself with the great help of Billy Strayhorn. Gerald Wilson was one of the very few arrangers who did compositions for it. Benny Carter, I think, did one or two. Lalo Schifrin did one. But that's a very few people who very few composers and arrangers did the Billy May, but a very few did for Duke.